1830, Britain had its first intercity railway. Only 40 years later, there were 15,000 miles of track carrying hundreds of these gigantic, high-pressure steam kettles that were all on fire. How did they prevent disasters? I am standing next to a fire burning at 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit, which is underneath a boiler working at 135 pounds per square inch. If that lot blows, we will all end up over in that field over there. Plus, this locomotive weighs 68 tonnes. If Phil the driver didn't know what he was doing, this could be a dangerous thing.
And not just dangerous, they could be deadly. These are the fastest vehicles anybody had ever seen. And safety standards took a definite back seat to technological advancements in the early days, with passenger and driver safety only improving through deadly trial and error.
They found out which bits were the most dangerous because they killed the most people, and they tried to fix them. The first potential hazard, the locomotive. An engine doesn't even have to be moving to be dangerous, and in fact, the first locos killed more workers when they were stationary. The main danger in the cab for the driver and the fireman is the steam pressure. It's at an incredible 160 pounds per square inch. Now, when the train's moving, that steam's being expended driving the pistons. But when it's stationary, when it's static, it can build up. Now, that's all very well with a welded steel boiler like this. But with early 19th century construction methods, it was a different matter. Nobody knows how many people died in boiler explosions on early steam locomotives, but it wasn't uncommon. The first two engines on the Stockton and Darlington exploded, killing their drivers and firemen. The problem was this. It's a big pressure vessel, obviously, it's a boiler, but it's moving. It's constantly subject to working forces. This is a modern boiler, beautifully engineered steel, hydraulic rivets.
This early engine, built in 1845, wasn't built with steel and hydraulic rivet guns. Its boiler was made of small wrought iron plates and rivets hammered by hand. It wasn't very exact. Some of the victims of boiler explosions lie in Bromsgrove churchyard, just south of Birmingham, near the Lickey Incline. In 1840, Thomas Scaife was only 28 when the locomotive he was working on blew up, killing him instantly. His fellow railwaymen saved for over 2 years to create this memorial stone to their lost colleague.
Boiler explosions were the biggest killers of drivers and firemen. When they went, they blew white-hot chunks of metal over 1/4 of a mile. Not very pleasant. What you needed, of course, was a safety valve on top of the boiler. This one here works with a spring. That holds it down, so it sets the safe pressure, and if it exceeds that, the steam blows out. The problem with the early ones is they had a fatal flaw. They were screwed in partially. So if you wanted to extract more pressure and more speed, you just screwed it in a bit further. One driver didn't like the sound of the safety valve, the sound it made with little bits of steam escaping, so he screwed it all the way in. So, when it finally blew, it took his ear off, so he never had to listen to it ever again. Adjusting the safety valve was a practice that firemen and engine drivers could pay for with their lives. But whether they tampered with the valve or not, they still had no real way of knowing how much pressure the boiler could take. They were only tested to 20 pounds per square inch over their working pressure, which only gave a 10% margin for error. And there was no test whatsoever for internal corrosion. A boiler blew in 1851, and it was found to be so badly corroded inside that parts of it were only 1/16 of an inch thick. Soon as the pressure built up, bang! It would have burst like an aortic aneurysm.
As the number of lines increased throughout Britain, so did the death toll. Exploding boilers were decimating the workforce, until in 1849 the government finally insisted that all boilers were to be properly pressure tested and always fitted with a pressure gauge before crews were allowed to step on board and risk their lives for the new railway companies.
So hopefully your boiler construction is sound enough for it not to explode, but you've got another problem. This. That fire is burning at 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit. The metal surrounding it would melt at half that temperature. Why doesn't it? Because it's surrounded by water, the water in the boiler. That cools it down sufficiently. It acts as a barrier. Now, that's all fine as long as you've got enough water in your boiler, otherwise it's all going to blow. So, you have to have a gauge.
The early engines had a simple glass tube for a water gauge, but these could easily snap, badly scalding the drivers. Later designs kept the gauge covered, preventing another cause of serious injuries in the cab.
Boiler safety may have been improving, but it was replaced by an even more serious problem. By 1845, only 15 years after the first passenger train, there were over 2,000 miles of track. But safety on the line in the early days lagged dangerously behind. Railway mania was spreading. The speed of trains was increasing, but so were the number of collisions.
Trains were firing their way across Britain, most frequently running on single-track lines, where the trains travelling in both directions have to share the same stretch of track. There had to be some way of controlling the movement of these massive engines, some way of signalling to the train drivers if they were heading for disaster.
The first line-side signals were given by policemen, which is why signalmen are called bobbies. Unable to speak to the driver, obviously, the only way they could indicate was by hand signals and flags. Thus, all clear, preferably with a white flag. Caution, arm held above the head with a green flag. And stop. According to the Regulations for Drivers and Firemen, Part 5, stop could also be signalled by waving any object with violence.
The signalman had no way of knowing where a train was once it was out of view, which meant trains travelling in the same direction were always in danger of crashing into the rear of a slower train in front of them.
And the only way to keep the trains apart was to make sure they left the station 10 minutes behind each other. And as most Victorian policemen didn't possess a watch, they used one of these.
But what happened when there was danger on the line and a signalman waving a flag couldn't be seen?
In bad visibility or falling snow, they relied on sound. Fog detonators, an explosive charge held onto the rail by a lead strap, so that when the loco went over it, it exploded and warned the driver of imminent danger. These should have been used in 1865 to warn a train of a missing piece of track. A train in which Charles Dickens was reading a proof of Our Mutual Friend. But the warning came too late, the train derailed, and Dickens famously rescued some of the passengers and watched many others die. He was said later to writhe nervously whenever an express train gathered speed, and his shattered nerves contributed to his death only 5 years later to the day from the accident. definitely make you stop.
By the middle of the 19th century, there was a railway building bonanza. As more and more people wanted to experience steam locomotion, the pressure grew to reduce the number of fatalities on the tracks.
As the system expanded, things got more complicated. More lines, more traffic, points were introduced, lines started to cross each other. It's all very well having policemen controlling the traffic. Well, actually, no, it wasn't. They couldn't see very far, and they couldn't be seen very well either, especially in bad weather. The system needed improvement.
How to improve the system was a subject for debate until 1842, when Charles Hutton Gregory adapted a piece of French revolutionary technology, le sémaphore, literally the sign carrier. It was used in relay stations to send messages to and from the army. Napoleon loved it. Gregory adapted it to a simple binary system.
This is the old type of semaphore signal. Very simple operation. This is all clear. There's nothing showing, no signal at all. Danger shows a semaphore signal. So, a clear road ahead was indicated by no signal, by no indication. Only when there was a danger did anything show. This system led to a terrible accident on the night of the 21st of January in 1876. There was a massive snowstorm that night. People said they'd never seen flakes of snow so big. A huge gale blowing across the whole of the northeast of the country. Coming south from Peterborough was a slow coal train that was about to be moved into a siding by the signalman to make way for the Flying Scotsman, thundering south, moving at its full speed, 50 miles an hour, 1876, remember. So, the signalman, in his cabin, pulls the lever to indicate danger. And he's amazed when he looks out of the window and sees the coal train still moving past. So, panic stations. Signalmen ran up the line and laid charges, small detonators that were clamped to the rail. So when the Flying Scotsman hit them, in the cab they heard these explosions. So he slammed on his anchors. But with all the snow and ice, the train skidded and was still moving about 15 to 20 miles an hour when it slammed into the back of the last 6 coal trucks, moving everything across the line.
The debris from the collision was strewn over a huge area, blocking both the north and southbound tracks. Meanwhile, the 5:30 p.m. Euston to Leeds Express was thundering north. It stood no chance and ploughed into the wreckage of the coal trucks and the tender of the Flying Scotsman lying across the tracks. 14 people were killed, mostly in the second collision. It was clear that something had gone awfully wrong with the signals. What had happened is that because of the snow and the ice, the signal had frozen down and it was impossible to indicate danger. This fatal crash led to a change in design. From then on, the signal arm could no longer freeze in its box. It had to always be on view and could be easily moved from all clear to danger. This lever is connected to the signal by wires and pulleys, so when I pull it, the signal is activated. And at night, signalling was all down to lights.
The electric light would have been a paraffin light originally, shines through the red filter and the signal is in the stop position. When it's in the proceed or all clear position, it shines through the green filter. A bit like a traffic light.
Safety signalling was starting to improve. But for the new railway companies, which were often cash-strapped because of their huge initial investment, safety wasn't always their #1 priority. In 1876, there was a head-on collision when a signal cabin was manned only by one 15-year-old boy who was too small to pull the levers and who wasn't even supplied with any paraffin to light the safety lamps. But some of the companies were better than others, and as long as there were trained staff on the job, the technology to help them had now been invented.
the government's Board of Trade had an important influence on safety standards. But there were also individuals, engineers like Edward Tyre, who was a bit of a hero when it came to safety devices. Ed Tyre's most important invention was the staff system. On single tracks, it's important, obviously, to avoid head-on collisions.
To start with, a policeman on the trackside used to hand over his truncheon and wouldn't let another train down the track until he had his truncheon back, therefore making sure there was only one train on the track at any one time. The beauty of Tyre's invention was that once a token had been removed, his mechanism would lock all the staff boxes down the line, ensuring no more tokens could be removed for that stretch. The drivers would be trained not to leave without it. Because of this, single-track safety improved dramatically. But when it came to tracking the movement of trains through the larger expanding stations with more than one line, they turned to the all-new electric telegraph. Cables were laid between the signal boxes, and by sending electric pulses down the line, the signalmen could finally communicate directly with each other. The signal box could now tell the next signal box down the line when a train had left the station and knew when it had arrived at the next station or the next signal box. Railway companies were initially reluctant to install this system due to the cost, but once they realised they could offer the public a telegraph system and make a lot of revenue from it, they were all for it. So, to send this train off, first of all I call the next signal box Horsted Keynes by telegraph. Wait for their reply. There we go. I now tell the next box, Horsted Keynes, by code what the train is. The golden arrow in this case. 4, 2, 1. So he knows what I'm talking about. If you divide the line into sections, using the telegraph you can now find out where each train is, rather than just timing them out of a station and waiting for them to arrive at the next. It's a start of block signalling, and it meant a massive reduction in the number of head-on collisions, which is largely a good thing. But one of the greatest pieces of technology for saving lives on the railways was the interlocking system. Before its invention, a signal could indicate one thing, but the points could be set to something completely different. John Saxby, an inventor, created the mechanism which locked the points and signal changes together. And this is how the interlocking lever system worked. I'm in the Exeter West box. I've just received notification on my block instrument that there is a down express that's from London passing through on its way to Plymouth, and I have to set the points and the signals to let that train through, but they have to be done in the right order. So, first of all, we set our relevant points. I'm using a rag here because signalmen were very, very house proud. Then, I have to lock that point. Black lever for points, blue lever for locking. Locked. And in order to stop a train overriding those two, we put the detonators on the relevant line. This is my favourite lever. The regulation was you had to stand 30 metres away from the detonator, so I think they will hear that. I can now set the signal. Right, that's all set. Once you've done that, you can't change these. It's an interlocking system. Brilliant. John Saxby's interlocking idea is the basis behind all subsequent signal and point systems ever built.
This is a big lad signal box. This is Crewe North Junction, right here. Crewe South Junction was even bigger. There were 5 boxes at Crewe, and in its heyday, there were 6 lines here. It was the Spaghetti Junction, the gravelly hill of the railway system. There's an indicator here, and as you can see, we've got miniature levers here because this is an electrically operated box. It's still the same block working system and there's still the same interlocking levers, but now it's electrical. The indication is by electric. Right, train leaving for the north from platform 2. Okay, I've got my indicators set. Same system, we have to make sure that everything is set so the train can proceed properly. So, I change both my points, my route selector here, and then I change my signal. And then I offer my train down to the section. Oh, quick! And transmit. Much easier, much more efficient in terms of space and also in terms of brawn. Signalmen can use their brains.
After years of exploding boilers, melting fireboxes and fatal collisions, it was down to the government to intervene and stop the carnage on the railways. In 1889, they pushed through the Regulation of the Railways Act, and finally, proper braking, block signalling and interlocking was to be enforced by law on all lines.
Early train travel was a dodgy business, and very scary, I shouldn't wonder, but then again, the early trains were the fastest things on the planet. Ways of controlling them had to be invented, but once those controls were fixed, trains became one of the safest ways of travelling. And, presuming the damn things turn up, they still are. Sorry. Proper. Other way. You might have known it had been the other way. It says open, shut. There's a big arrow. But the arrow is to tell you which way's open, not which way's shut.